They say retirement is supposed to be the best years of your life, but no one tells you it's also the perfect time to uncover decades of lies. I thought I had spent the last 30 years building a future with the woman I loved. Turns out, she had been building something with someone else. And the worst part? She didn't even try to hide it. My name is Mark, and I turned 60 this year. After nearly 4 decades in the workforce, I finally retired, ready to enjoy the fruits of my labor with my wife, Emily. We had been married for 32 years, raised 2 kids, paid off the mortgage, and planned a retirement full of travel, relaxation, and long, peaceful mornings without alarms. I imagined this chapter of my life as a reward for everything I had worked for. Emily and I had met in college. She was the ambitious, charming type, always the center of attention in any room, while I was the steady, dependable one. I was the guy who made things work, who kept our finances in order, who made sure our life had structure and stability. I always thought we balanced each other out. Where I was practical, she was passionate. Where I was reserved, she was expressive. It had always worked. Or so I thought. For my retirement gift, Emily suggested we redecorate the house. A fresh start, a new look for our new phase of life. It made sense. We had spent decades collecting clutter, keeping things for later that we never used. So, we started sorting through boxes in the attic. I wasn't exactly thrilled about spending my first week of retirement digging through old junk, but I went along with it. That was my first mistake. The second mistake was assuming the past days buried. Halfway through an old storage bin, I found a stack of envelopes tied together with a faded red ribbon. The paper had yellowed slightly with age, but the handwriting was still crisp. Neat cursive, carefully written, not mine. I don't know what made me open the first one. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something deeper. A quiet, unspoken fear I hadn't realized was sitting in my gut. I unfolded the first letter and started reading. The words hit me harder than I expected. The tone was affectionate, familiar, intimate in a way that wasn't meant for me. Whoever had written this letter knew my wife deeply, understood her in a way I hadn't questioned in years. They wrote about stolen moments, about love that had endured despite the circumstances, about a connection that never faded. I flipped to the signature at the bottom. It wasn't signed with a name, just the letter D. My hands were shaking. I reached for another letter, then another. Each one followed the same pattern, carefully written, deeply personal, full of emotions I thought were only meant for me. But I was wrong. And the worst part? The earliest letters were from before we got married. The latest? 3 years ago. 30 years of marriage. 30 years of building a life together. Raising kids, making sacrifices, believing in a future we were supposed to share. And all this time, she had been writing love letters to another man. I sat there in the attic, the box of letters in front of me, trying to breathe, trying to understand what I was looking at. This wasn't just a mistake. This wasn't just an old flame she had long forgotten. This was something she had never let go of. And now, I had to decide what to do next. They say the past always catches up with you, but I never thought it would show up in my own attic, tied neatly with a red ribbon. I sat there for what felt like hours, holding those letters, my heart hammering against my ribs, my breath uneven. This was supposed to be the happiest time of my life. Retirement, relaxation, the reward for decades of hard work. Instead, I was sitting in a pile of old boxes, staring at proof that my wife had spent our entire marriage keeping a part of herself for someone else. The worst part wasn't the letters themselves. It was the consistency. This wasn't some short-lived affair, some moment of weakness she had buried out of guilt. It was ongoing. It had started before we got married and, at least according to the most recent letter, had continued long after. 3 years ago. That meant while I was planning for our future, she was still looking over her shoulder at her past. I unfolded another letter, my hands shaking as I skimmed the words. There was no hesitation in her writing, no guilt, just longing, reminiscing, the kind of intimate, familiar tone that a person uses when they are writing to someone they trust completely. She wrote about missing him, about the way she still thought about their moments together, about how much she wished things had been different. Different? Different how? I flipped through another. This one dated from the year our youngest child was born. The word stung. She wrote about feeling trapped, about wondering what could have been. And then, as if it wasn't bad enough, she had written something that sent ice through my veins. Sometimes I wonder if I made the wrong choice. Wrong choice? I was the wrong choice? I felt the air leave my lungs, a slow realization creeping in. She had been married to me for decades, but part of her had still been waiting for someone else. And the worst part? I had never even known his name. The letters were only signed with an initial, D. No last name. No clear details. Just a single letter, like he was some ghost she had kept locked away. But he wasn't a ghost. He was real. And I had a feeling he was still out there. I sat in that attic, surrounded by memories that now felt tainted, warped, false. Every anniversary, every "I love you," every night spent thinking we were building something strong. All while she was secretly writing love letters to someone else. But the question burned inside me. Was it just letters? Had she kept this purely emotional? Or was there more? Had she seen him? I took a deep breath, forcing myself to think rationally. There was no point confronting her without more information. If I walked downstairs right now and threw these letters in her face, she would deny, twist, gaslight. Whatever she had to do to rewrite the truth. No, I needed more. I needed to find out exactly who Dee was. And that meant digging into a past I never knew existed. I started with the letters themselves, looking for details, places, dates, anything that could point me in a direction. A few letters mentioned a specific lake house, somewhere they had gone together before we were married. Could that be a clue? I didn't recognize the name of the place, but it was something. Then, another letter caught my eye. It was one of the older ones, but it mentioned something concrete. A city. I grabbed my phone and started searching. It took a while, but after going down a rabbit hole of public records and online searches, I found a name. An old college boyfriend. Someone who had lived in that exact city around the time the letter started. His name? Daniel. The pieces started clicking together. If this was him, and if she had been keeping this connection alive for decades, then I needed to know more. Because suddenly, the letters didn't feel like just words on paper. They felt like a trail, and I had no idea where it led. They say the past always catches up with you, but no one ever tells you what to do when it shows up in your own home, wrapped in a neat little bow. I thought I was just organizing old storage, preparing for the next phase of my life after retirement. Instead, I found a shoebox filled with my wife's past lovers. And now, I was sitting in the attic, staring at proof that my entire marriage had been built on a lie. At first, I thought I had uncovered an old affair, something that had happened years ago before we got married. But the more I read, the more I realized that this wasn't just a one-time betrayal. It was a pattern. 12 letters, spanning 12 years, all addressed to a single man, D. I needed to know who he was. That name became an obsession. I searched every letter for clues, dates, locations, anything that could help me track him down. It didn't take long before I found it. A small detail buried in one of the older letters mentioned a city, a place Lauren had visited long before we were together. I started searching online, cross-referencing names and locations, following any lead I could find. And then, after hours of digging, I found him. Daniel. The name jumped off the screen at me. An old boyfriend, someone Lauren had dated before we met. It all made sense now. She had never let him go. She had spent our entire marriage writing to him, holding on to him, keeping him alive in those letters while I lived in blissful ignorance. But then I saw something else. Daniel was dead. The obituary was there, clear as day. He had died 3 years ago. And that was when everything clicked. 3 years ago wasn't just any year. That was the year Lauren took a last-minute business trip. She had told me it was urgent, something that couldn't be avoided. I hadn't questioned it at the time. I trusted her. She had packed quickly, left in a hurry, and came back acting different. I had assumed it was just stress. Now, I knew the truth. She wasn't working. She was saying goodbye. Lauren had left me, flown to another state, and stood over the grave of the man she had been secretly loving for decades. And then, she had come home and kissed me like nothing had happened. I sat there in silence, feeling something inside me break. This wasn't just an affair. This wasn't just betrayal. This was an entire secret life. And now that I knew the truth, There was no way I was going to let her get away with it. She thought she had buried her past. She had no idea I was about to dig it up. People always say that confronting a cheater should be the moment of satisfaction, the moment where everything comes to a head, where the truth finally forces its way out and justice is served. But no one ever talks about what it's like to hear the words you always feared, to watch the person you built your life with admit, without hesitation, that they never really loved you the way you loved them. I had spent days preparing. I had read the letters again and again, traced the ink of her handwriting, let the weight of each year of our marriage crumble under the knowledge that she had been holding on to someone else. I had gone back to every conversation, every anniversary, every kiss, looking for the signs I had missed. And now, finally, I was ready to lay it all out in front of her. Lauren walked in from work like nothing was wrong, carrying her purse, scrolling through her phone, humming softly to herself. She didn't notice the letters on the table right away. She had no idea that this was the last normal day of her life. When she finally looked down and saw them, her expression didn't change at first. She glanced at the letters, the neatly stacked envelopes, the printed obituary of Daniel that I had placed on top of them, like the final nail in a coffin she had buried years ago. Then, slowly, she sat down. I told her everything. I told her about finding the shoebox, about reading the letters, about realizing that she had never really been mine. I told her that I knew about the trip 3 years ago, that she hadn't been on a business trip. She had gone to say goodbye to the only man she had ever truly loved. I laid it all out, every lie, every missing piece, every detail she had tried to keep buried. And then, I waited for her to deny it. I expected anger, excuses, desperate attempts to twist the truth. But Lauren didn't deny a thing. She didn't even look surprised. Instead, she let out a slow breath, looked down at the letters, and simply said that she was sorry. Not sorry for the deception. Not sorry for the years of lying. She was sorry that I had to find out. That was when I realized just how deep the betrayal really went. Lauren admitted it all. She told me that Daniel had always been the one, that they had fallen in love young, but that he hadn't been ready to settle down. He wanted to travel, live freely, experience life without being tied down. She, on the other hand, had wanted security, marriage, a life that felt stable and safe. She had waited for him, hoping he would change, but when it became clear that he wouldn't, she had moved on with me. Or at least, that's what she had told herself. In reality, she had never truly moved on. Even after we got married, she had kept writing to him, keeping the connection alive. She told herself it was harmless, that it was just a way to hold on to something that once meant everything to her. But then, at some point, it had become more than that. The letters weren't just letters. They were confessions. They were an escape. They were a way for her to live the life she never got to have with him. And she had done it every single year of our marriage. She wasn't crying. She wasn't begging for forgiveness. She was just being honest. She told me that she had never meant to hurt me, that she had loved me in her own way, that our life together had been good, even happy. But when she thought about the love that made her feel alive, the love that made her feel like she couldn't breathe without it, it wasn't me. It had always been him. And that was why she had gone to his funeral alone. I listened, my hands gripping the edge of the table, feeling every word settle into my chest like a weight I would never be able to lift. I had spent 3 decades believing in something that was never real. I had built a life, a marriage, a future, only to find out that I had been nothing more than her second choice. I asked her why. Why marry me? Why spend her life with me if she had never let him go? Her answer was simple. Because I was the better option. Daniel had been unpredictable. He had been exciting, intoxicating, but he wasn't safe. I was safe. I was stable. I was the right choice, the smart choice, the reliable man who would never leave her, never disappoint her. But I was never the love of her life. She didn't regret marrying me. She didn't regret our life together. But if she could go back and choose again, if she could rewrite history and live in a world where Daniel had been ready when she was, she would have never chosen me at all. I sat there, feeling the weight of 30 years collapse around me. The realization that I had been living in someone else's shadow, that every anniversary, every kiss, every whispered, "I love you," had been shared with a ghost. She thought her honesty would bring closure, that by finally telling me the truth, she was somehow making things right. But I wasn't looking for closure. I was looking for a way out. She had spent our entire marriage choosing him, even after he was gone. Now, for the first time in 30 years, I was going to choose myself. People say divorce is like ripping off a bandage, quick and painful, but ultimately necessary. But no one talks about what happens when the wound underneath has been there for years, festering while you lived in blissful ignorance. No one warns you that when the bandage comes off, you're left staring at something rotten, something that was never going to heal properly because it was never whole to begin with. That's what I felt as I sat in my lawyer's office, signing the final papers that would end my 32-year marriage. I had spent decades believing I had built something unbreakable, something that would carry me through my later years with the woman I had chosen. But in reality, I had spent those years being someone's second choice. After Lauren admitted everything, there was nothing left to salvage. She didn't beg me to stay. She didn't try to deny what I had found. She just sat there, staring at the letters I had laid out, the same letters she had written over the years, pouring out her heart to a man who had never married her, had never built a life with her, had never grown old with her. And yet, he was the one she had loved. Not me. Never me. I packed my bags that night. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation. The air between us was dead, filled with the silent acknowledgement that we were no longer husband and wife. We had never really been in the way that mattered. She had shared a house with me, but her heart had never been mine. That truth was too heavy to carry. So I left it behind, along with everything that reminded me of the life I thought we had. Moving out wasn't the hard part. It was realizing that I had nowhere to go that really hit me. When you spend decades building a future with someone, it becomes your entire world. The house, the routines, the plans for retirement. It had all been centered around a marriage that, as it turned out, had been half-lived. Now, I was standing outside with a suitcase, staring at my car, realizing that for the first time in 30 years, I was alone. I rented a small apartment outside the city, nothing extravagant, just enough space for myself. It felt temporary, a limbo between the life I had and the one I was about to create. The first few nights were the worst. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. The weight of my own thoughts pressed down on me, forcing me to confront something I had been avoiding. I wasn't grieving the loss of Lauren. I was grieving the life I thought I had. Lauren had reached out a few times after I left. The messages were always the same. She was sorry. She never wanted to hurt me. She wished things had been different. But what she never said was that she wished she had chosen me. She never said she regretted loving Daniel instead. And that told me everything I needed to know. I never responded. There was no point. She had spent 30 years loving someone else. She could spend the next 30 missing me. I don't know if Daniel ever knew the depth of Lauren's devotion. Maybe he had moved on. Maybe he had lived his life without ever realizing that he had a woman writing him letters for decades, mourning a love that had never been. Maybe, in the end, Lauren had been just as much a fool as I had. But the difference was, she had a choice. She had chosen to marry me. She had chosen to build a life with me. And yet, she had spent all those years wondering if she had made the wrong decision. I wouldn't spend my remaining years doing the same. Starting over at 60 wasn't something I had ever planned for. I had expected to be traveling with my wife, spending slow mornings reading the paper, enjoying the freedom that retirement was supposed to bring. Instead, I was relearning what it meant to live for myself. Some days were harder than others, but for the first time in a long time, I wasn't trying to measure up to a ghost. I wasn't competing with a love story I had never been part of. The letters are gone now. I burned them one night, watching as 3 decades of deception turned to ash. There was no satisfaction in it, no sense of victory, just the finality of it all. The past was the past, and for the first time, I was ready to leave it behind.